Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General John Allen. Well, this is the part of the evening that, of course, I loved being able to honor Ben and Peter. This is the part of the evening that I really am looking forward to, because to have John Allen with us is to have the repository of American commitment to American values throughout the Middle East, throughout the world. John Allen is, in my view, one of the great American heroes. So, all right, now with that build up, John.
I got 20 for you afterwards.
So we are now almost 100 days into the Trump administration. Now, I think it's fair to say from the outset, Donald Trump was not your choice as president. You were with her, as they say. But let's take a dispassionate look in terms of the issue for which you had major responsibility, principal responsibility, throughout much of the last few years, the fight against ISIS, against radical Islamic terrorism. How, in your view, are we doing? How is President Trump and the new administration doing?
I don't have to be anywhere till 6 tomorrow morning, so let me just start with a couple of comments, if I may. First, to the ladies and gentlemen in here this evening.
Can we, let's put the volume up a bit and make sure that. Yeah.
How we doing?
There you go.
I'll just transition to my Paris Island voice if this thing doesn't work. First, let me thank the ladies and gentlemen who are in here this evening, who are both leaders within the Washington Institute and supporters of it. What Rob didn't say, and it's not in any of the biographical information, is I've have more than a passing connection with other think tanks, Brand X organizations in Washington. And I'll say 2 words about this entity, impact and influence. And I don't think, having watched what has been going on in the world for a long time, either in East Asia or in Central Asia or in the Middle East, I don't think there's ever been a time when this organization is more important to the country, and perhaps through this country, the world, than right now. And your support for this organization is making that possible. So let me thank you for that. This really is a national treasure, the Washington Institute, and I've been watching it both from a distance when I was serving on active duty, but also more recently in other duties. I'd like to say one other quick thing as well. I fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and I fought amongst populations where the social fabric had been torn completely asunder, where institutions of governance, institutions of control, institutions of law and order were utterly absent in the lives of most of these people. And I came to suddenly understand why and how important our law enforcement officials are. And I've met 2 law enforcement officials here tonight from the Sheriff's Department and from the Police Department of Los Angeles. And I have to tell you, when people say thank you to me for my service or thanks to a diplomat for their service, I don't think there's ever been a time in this country where we're more keenly attuned to the sacrifices of our law enforcement individuals because of the price they're paying every single day. And I'd like to recognize them as well. You know, we're early in the administration, and I think that the challenges that we have, that we're facing right now for any one president would be dramatic under any circumstances. President Obama, of course, had the economic crisis that he had to step into. He had 2 wars to deal with, but those were wars that were in relatively mature theaters. This president has really strapped on a whole series of difficulties. And the problem that I have is really a twofold, is at 2 levels with the administration. First, the administration has a very difficult time communicating right now. We find very senior leaders that are using different terms in different descriptions of various events or policies that have had the effect of confusing the American people, have had the effect of confusing our allies, and in some respects have confused our opponents and our enemies. That would be the first observation that I would make. And you know, if I were king for a day, one of the things that I would do is seek in every possible way to make sure that when the Secretary of State says something, it is something similar to what's being said by the UN, the ambassador to the United Nations, and so on. Because what happens is this is a problem, because it causes our opponents, who we really want to target, it causes them to wonder about the second issue that I wanted to raise, and that is the absence of policy in a lot of areas. I know that we are working very hard. I have very close friends in the administration, and I won't name them because I'd like them to be able to remain in the administration. But I know that there's a lot of hard work being done to formulate policy. And in the absence of that, for example, we have a problem in North Korea, which is seen often as a one-off issue. It's as a part, as opposed to as an issue in the larger Northeast Asia context or the larger China context, where we fire cruise missiles, I believe properly so, to punish the Assad regime for a chemical weapons attack upon innocent civilians, but there's no policy context for the firing of those cruise missiles, and we're not quite sure what the next position is going to be by the United States on the use of military force. I did support the use of military force in that regard. I think it's important that the United States must be prepared to use military force. But military force without a political context is a dangerous thing, just as the use of policy without ever having a willingness to use force is just as dangerous. So we've got to have a balance between the two, and less than 100 days into this, the difficulties with communications and I think an absence of coherent policy on some of the most difficult issues that we face has made it very difficult for this administration to get traction. It has concerned many of our opponents, many of our allies overseas, and of course it's confused our opponents. And confusing our opponents isn't necessarily a bad thing, Rob, as you know. But what it does is it creates an environment for miscalculation, and especially in the North Korean situation, when you may be coming to a question on that. He did not share his questions with me, and of course that's always a dangerous thing. When you're talking about the North Korean or the Korean peninsular conflict, and I spent some time dealing with the war plans for these, you know, we're talking within 96 hours to 5 days, as many as 1 million men fighting on both sides of the DMZ. We need to make sure we don't sleepwalk our way into a war with North Korea. And when you have ambiguous policy or conflicting statements, it creates an environment for miscalculation. When you are provocative and you're ambiguous, you're not creating an environment that necessarily achieves your policy objectives when you don't have a policy. What it does is it creates an environment for miscalculation, and that can be a recipe for war. So communications and policy, and that's the two things that we desperately need right now in this administration. There's lots of other things, but those two things are key issues.
So, John, when we look at the fight against ISIS, I think it's fair to say that in the traditional military sense, we and our allies are going to defeat them in Mosul, and we and our allies will defeat them in Raqqa. But how do we make sure that that actually defeats ISIS, and that ISIS doesn't come back in another incarnation the way Al-Qaeda came back, the way Al-Qaeda in Iraq came back, and hopefully, well, that we don't see it again?
That's a great question, and it's probably the question for our time right now. ISIS rides on a series of ideas, and it is the idea of the caliphate, it is the idea of the inevitability of this brand of Islam, the Salafi jihadist Islam, that has created an environment that has given ISIS the capacity to operate on the ground in the Middle East. So let me make a couple of broad observations. I've had the chance to fight Al-Qaeda, I've had the chance to fight the Taliban, I've had the chance to fight ISIS. The thing that tied them all together was a common ideology, a Salafist, jihadist ideology. We're not at war with Islam. Unfortunately, if you listen to the inaugural address, it talked about the eradication of radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth, and the United States leading the community of civilized nations. And I've not heard that term in a very long time. When you declare war on a faith, that means that your options become very limited in how you can achieve your objectives. My own view is that with respect to Daesh, ISIS, we have been pretty successful in defeating it physically, as the TWI or the Washington Institute scholar, I think, accurately said. We are well on the way towards defeating it in Mosul and Raqqa. We should continue to pursue it in an annihilation effort in the region. But Daesh has become a three-headed monster. It is not just the physical entity, which we call core ISIL, on the ground in Iraq and Syria. We now have a provincial ISIL, meaning there are organizations around the world that have run up the black flag and call itself part of ISIL. We're going to have to deal with those over time. But I think the thing that worries me the most about this organization, and it really deserves our attention, is that we now have a global network of this entity fueled and riding on the Internet of Things and by the capacity for fully encrypted telephone communications that gives this entity, and will give future entities, the capacity to plan globally, to move regionally, and to attack tactically and locally, and do it all completely encrypted and in the dark. This is the challenge that we face with this organization today. And the President is right. We do have to fight now to defend ourselves. But we have to take a generational approach to this. And it can't be about fighting. I'm sitting at a table with two young men, grandsons of Ben, and their future shouldn't be about having to serve in the military to fight terrorists 30 years from now. But if that's the only option that we exploit, if that's the only approach we take, that's all we're ever going to do. So we have to have a deeper strategy that talks about and considers and implements using the community of nations, not the civilized nations, but the community of nations, to come together to help to build stability and capacity in countries around the world that are under assault today, that need our help today. But the solution isn't just about fighting. The solution is about beating Daesh in the superiority of our ideas. Our idea has got to be better than theirs. The faith of Islam, as it is practiced by the people of those countries, has got to be the shining light within that country, and the Salafi jihadist ideology cannot be a competitor in that process. Egypt is an example. There is a lot of work that we can do with Egypt to help President Sisi to stabilize that country for a whole variety of reasons, not just in helping Egypt. But if Egypt goes down at a very selfish level for the United States, if we have a contingency in the Middle East, we have to fly through Egyptian airspace and we have to use the Suez Canal. Egypt is a country of extraordinary strategic importance to the United States. We should be doing everything we can, not just to help Egypt with its security issues, but to help Egypt economically, and other countries like Egypt that have strategic importance to us, help them to build capacity within the institutions that count, that can reduce radicalization over time. So we'll fight because we have to fight, but if that's our only solution, it's 100 years war, folks, and get ready for it. We've got to be thinking deep, a generation from now, how we can do things today to stabilize our strategic partners, and then help the other countries to build institutions and a social fabric that reduces the amount of radicalization, that creates an unending reservoir of foot soldiers for these extremists, because these people have no options. They live in countries that are not inclusive, there's no justice, there's no human rights, the women they're completely disenfranchised, there's little access to education, and worst of all, their education or their economic opportunities are very, very limited. So if it's all about fighting, get ready. It'll be 100 years war, and we'll be fighting till those kids are having grandchildren themselves. It's got to be more than that. We need to be thinking deep, and it can't be about an eradication solution, which was the President's vision in his inaugural address.
General, this leads to a couple of questions. One, here we've all just heard you, a four-star general, urge everyone in this room not to focus solely and exclusively on the military tool. Now, there is a lot of talk when you look at some of the appointees in the new administration that there are too many generals. Let me ask you, when generals get together, just in a closed room, have a cup of coffee or whatever it is generals drink, is the common talk how we can use the military tool, or is the common understanding more along the lines of what you just said, how we need to complement the military tool with all the other tools at our disposal?
It's the latter, Rob. Look, we've been eye deep in gore for a long time, and not one of us believes that that's the way we should be oriented in solving these problems. The greatest force on this planet isn't the United States military. By the way, it's a pretty potent capability. But the greatest force on this planet is the economy of the United States backed up by a democratic United States of America. We are the only country on the planet that has convening authority to do right. Everyone else has convening authority to some extent to pursue their objectives, their interests. But the United States stands for something. And we have global reach and global convening authority. We stand for something. And our economy is massively strong. Our institutions are massively capable. And we think, when generals get together, other than perhaps compare fashion, we think a lot about grand strategy, not military strategy. It's the identification of political objectives, which is how strategy begins. What is our policy objective, and what should those be, and how then do we create a strategy that leverages every aspect of American power? And when you talk about American power, that's often a pejorative term in some people's minds. We should be proud of American power because, in general, if we're doing things right, American power is doing good for the world. We're a transformational power. It's one of the only ones in the history of mankind. We are a transformational power. We have made the world better because of the presence of America in history. And so we need to think about how we preserve that by putting together the kinds of grand strategic approaches which then can leverage all aspects of American power. And I also said we're leaders. We should also talk about how we leverage the capacity to bring together our partners in the world with similar values, our European partners, our Asian partners, partners around the world. That community of nations, not the civilized nations, but the community of nations that share our values, share our interests, when led by the United States, we have the capacity to make a difference at a grand strategic level that far exceeds at a military level.
The proverbial national security question. What keeps you up at night, John?
One of the things that keeps me up is confusing our enemies to the extent that we could easily see miscalculation. And I have to tell you, I'm worried about Northeast Asia right now. And I hope we're not sleepwalking into a war on the Korean Peninsula. The enormity of that conflict defies explanation. I'm telling you, when 1 million men are fighting across the DMZ, when we don't know how many, but it's probably a couple tens of thousands of artillery pieces tonight are pointed at Seoul, Korea, the capital of one of the most advanced states on the surface of the earth, a functioning democracy. It's in trouble right now because its democratic process is actually working. But those artillery pieces, if Kim Jong-un decides to go to war with us, believes that if he doesn't inflict massive damage on the South to intimidate the United States to sue for peace, those artillery pieces can fire from position. All you have to do is pull the lanyard. There would be tens of thousands of artillery rounds raining on the capital of South Korea. We better not sleepwalk into a war in Northeast Asia. That's what keeps me up right now. The other thing that keeps me up is the instability of a number of really key partners. And when this goes to your point about what generals think about, when I hear about us receiving a bump in our military budget of $54 billion, okay, I'm momentarily excited about that. But I want to know what's behind the $54 billion. But then when I hear in the same conversation that we're cutting the State Department by as much as 30 to 35%, which is the entity in the world which represents our foreign policy, which is the entity in the world that's responsible for the diplomatic outreach to explain who we are as a people and what our interests are. But very importantly, when we cut our foreign assistance, our foreign aid, and our USAID, that's exactly the influence in the world today where the United States can make a difference in stabilizing the very countries that I have talked about. When you cut the State Department back 30%, that creates an enormous gap in their capabilities. And my dear friend Jim Mattis said it very well once when he testified. And they said,
Secretary of Defense.
He's now Secretary of Defense. When he was testifying as a four-star general, he was asked by, I think, John McCain in the Senate Armed Services Committee, General, what do you have to say about if we end up cutting the budget of the U.S. State Department? And Jim said, if we cut the budget of the State Department, you're just going to have to buy more bullets for me. Because the consequences will be that with less diplomacy, there's the likelihood for greater conflict. And this should not be the choice. This is not guns and butter. I mean, this should be a choice of where we do both for both of those agencies, the Department of State and Department of Defense.
So we've touched on North Korea, we've touched on Syria and Iraq. I want to ask you about a country that you have also considerable experience with, and this is Israel. Now, in recent years, Israel has avoided the chaos of the Arab Spring and even the turmoil of Syria, but the threats are getting closer, whether they be ISIS and Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas, all on the borders around Israel, whether in Lebanon, Syria, Sinai, or Gaza. So how would you, professional military expert, how would you evaluate Israel's security situation and the role the United States plays in it?
Well, yeah, as you correctly point out in your question, the strategic environment of the region in my lifetime probably has not been more challenging in terms of Israel's security. I remember I was in Israel in the very early days of 2011 as the Arab Spring was beginning to break out. And I was, many of you may know, I spent a lot of time with the IDF, very senior leaders of the IDF. And there was this interesting conversation that we were having as we were thinking our way through what the implications were. And I found myself in the presence of a generation of Israeli general officers who had not experienced personally the Yom Kippur War, had not experienced the '67 war, had perhaps had some experience in peace in Galilee, had some experience in Lebanon, but for Israel, for most of the time of the living general officers, the serving general officers, their borders had been at peace. And much of what they had to deal with was insurgencies inside greater Israel, if you will, insurgencies inside Gaza, the West Bank, Hezbollah, but it was insurgencies by and large. Now they were really facing. Now it was interesting to see the realization that Israel was facing a vast array of external threats. And it was for me, watching that, an opportunity to see just how enormously flexible and innovative inherent the Israeli generals are, and it is inherent to the culture of the IDF. It's a remarkable culture. So to that extent, my own view, having been in and out of the country maybe 100 times since 10, my own view is that internally the security of Israel is pretty good. And as we would like to believe in the United States, it is a function of the Shin Bet, it's a function of activities outside the border with Mossad, It's a function of incredible cooperation with the IDF and then the Israeli National Police Force. There's a synergy there between security services, intelligence services, law enforcement, and the IDF that I think by and large has given Israel, in this enormously chaotic moment, a level of internal security that all of us would beg to have in almost any other country. But that doesn't mean that there aren't enormous challenges out there. And I have to say, one of the challenges I think that is going to emerge is going to be the challenge that comes from an unresolved Middle East peace process. I think the binational state process is a cul-de-sac. I think it's a dead-end option. And we need to continue to push. At least the United States' announced policy should be that we remain committed to a two-state outcome. And whether we can't see progress right now, and there's all kinds of reasons why it's hard right now, we should continue to remain committed to it. So at least we can provide a sense of hope, both to the Israelis who are committed to it, but also to the Palestinians who desperately yearn for it as well. Although the political issues are very difficult inside Israel, the political chaos within the leadership of the Palestinians makes it very difficult for a coherent approach to move forward. And then the strategic environment around Israel makes it difficult. But we must remain committed to it. I think we must have a solid policy that's a two-state process, and we'll see where that goes.
And could you say a few words, and from your background, your experience, American military and Israeli military? Put aside the politics, it comes and goes. How would you evaluate today the relationship between our two militaries?
It's very good. It's very good. As a young officer, some of the most important study that I undertook of military operations, maneuver operations, were the case studies of the Israeli military, the IDF. IDF fighting in 67 and 73, and 73 in particular. If you, as I have many times, and I've actually done it at the grand strategic level, if you want to talk about building a campaign or a strategy, there are very few people better at envisaging campaign design and strategic design than Israelis. And again, this culture of innovation, this high culture of education. So, to our benefit, the United States, I think we have a very close relationship with Israel in that regard. But we also have, happily, a very close relationship with our security services also. So it's not just the IDF and the U.S. military, it's our intelligence services with their counterparts in Israel. That gives us enormous capacity to share information, gives us enormous capacity to share technology, and frankly, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room, the relationship between the United States and Israel, it's not just a relationship of the heart, which I think is at its base the most important dimension, the relationship of the heart between the American people and the Jewish people, the Israeli people. It is a relationship that then upon that foundation we do all of the things. But it's unique in the world. We have a closer relationship with Israel than I believe, and I've got some experience at this, than we have with almost any other country on the planet. Perhaps our relationship with Australia and the UK come close, but if you were to rack and stack the top 5 countries in the world with whom we have a close relationship that is so close that the lines blur between the distinctions of nationalities, Israel, Australia, the United Kingdom, and I think I'd have to think hard about others after that. It's a very unique relationship, and it's one we have to preserve.
Thank you. Listen, John, there's just one more country I want to ask you about. It's the one when Secretary Mattis was in the Gulf just this week. He said, if you're looking for any trouble in the Middle East, you can find Iran behind that trouble. He was asked what the top priorities were in terms of dealing with the Middle East, and it was, after destroying ISIS, it was Iran, Iran, Iran. You've been dealing with Iran for many years. what would you say is the big picture approach that we need to have to deal with the Islamic Republic?
Well, you know, we thought there would be a time when we could find common ground with the Islamic Republic at one point. And this has come and gone over the last several years, but I think at this juncture, the likelihood of our being able to do that is pretty slim. If we take one step back, when I talk to people today who are trying to grasp the problems in the Middle East, the first thing I tell them is if you began your analysis of, say, Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or Yemen, if you began your analysis of any crisis in the Middle East and it doesn't begin with attempting to understand the relationship between what I would simply call the Saudi-Iranian Cold War, if it doesn't start by trying to understand what the Iranian-Saudi Cold War, what influence that's having on that particular issue, then you've probably missed a big chunk of how you should begin to think about this. Iran, for me, and Jim Mattis, I believe, would say the same thing, Iran is the principal destabilizing influence in the region. It is through its security dependency, Syria, it is funneling and will continue to funnel weapons to Lebanese Hezbollah, which makes Iran for me and Lebanese Hezbollah for me a strategic threat for Israel. And I just had a chance to talk with the Jerusalem Post last couple of days about in the aftermath, as we see political change occur in Damascus, the United States has got to be very, very careful and very, very attentive to what that political change looks like so that we don't replace one enabler of Iranian threat to Israel with another in the outcome of political change in Damascus. We just need to be attentive to that. How do we handle this, Rob? It comes from, I think, working more closely with our partners in the region under the last administration, and I had very close ties to the last administration. I think the world of President Obama. But we did not lead in the region in the manner I believe that we needed to. The Iranians are absolutely lining up their partners to destabilize our Arab allies in the region. They're lining up their partners to eclipse American influence in the region. And many of you know this name, Qasem Soleimani, who commands the IR, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Special Operations, called the Quds Force, the Jerusalem Force, the force that will liberate Jerusalem. He brags today that Iran calls the shots in 4 capitals in the region: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. He says there are more that are coming. Iran's going to do this, is going to exert its influence more, and he might add Kabul in the not too distant future. The point for us needs to be, while we weren't willing to lead before, we now need to begin to lead in a more comprehensive way with our Arab partners in the region, the capacity to push back against Iranian efforts for instability, which means where we need to build capacity within those governments that are under attack, and where we might have to use military force to push back directly upon Iran or its surrogates in order to relieve the pressure on our Arab partners. We can't permit any more Arab states in the region to collapse as a direct result of Iranian influence and Iranian instability. If you don't like what you see in Syria, it can be worse in other countries. And there's one of the direct reasons for Syria being as bad as it is that the principal ally to Bashar al-Assad is Iran, is Lebanese Hezbollah doing the bidding of Iran, Shia extremist militia elements that have either migrated as far away as Afghanistan to the Syrian battlefield. Iran is the linchpin and the link for virtually all of that. And it's now, I believe, is the time for this administration to begin actively working with our Arab partners in the region to organize them in a manner, first to make them proof from Iranian interference, and then over time to create a security arrangement in some form or another with those partners where they can begin to push back in a comprehensive way against Iran and to start to take back some of those Arab countries that have collapsed.
So you believe that this is possible?
Not tomorrow. This is going to be a long-term strategy because One of the things that was revealed in the Arab Spring was the inherent weakness of Arab governance. Right now, many of the Arab states are desperately trying to just govern themselves. At the same time, they're under assault by insurgent elements that are in fact supported by Iran. So this is part of that long-term strategy. We have to help stabilize those countries that are important to us, or we're going to see them continue to go down. And look what's happened. You know, we have a failed state in Yemen. We have a failed state in Syria. We have a failed state, this is not about Iran necessarily, but it's not far from the influence, failed state in Libya, and we have the potential for a failed state in Iraq in the aftermath of the defeat of Daesh. The Iranian hand is somewhere in all of that. We can't afford to have any more Arab states go down, and we ought to be doing everything we can to support the Arab states and to try to recover those that we can. Lebanon is the perfect example. That is a jump ball. We could conceivably still recover Lebanon, but when 15,000 Lebanese Hezbollah fighters hardened in the battlefield from Syria return to Lebanon, it's going to be difficult to envisage a force inside Lebanon that would be favorable to the West and the United States and to Sunni Arab partners be able to stand up to that hardened Hezbollah force. So it's not going to happen tomorrow, but if you don't start to think strategically and to have a plan ultimately to act strategically, then every one of these things become a strategic crisis for you.
And this really is a message I want to underscore, a serious message on which I'm going to close tonight's session, which is there is a long-term struggle that's going on. There are no quick fixes. It is a struggle which is military in one dimension, but not just military. It is ideological. It is political. It is economic. It is educational. It is diplomatic. It is cultural. It is also civilization. There are all these aspects to this long-term struggle. It is a struggle that combines adversaries, Iran on one hand, radical Sunni jihadism on the other. But this is the struggle of the 21st century. And I know, with your support, that we at the Institute, led by the guidance of people like General John Allen, can make a powerful impact on how our government leads this fight. So friends, thank you so much. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.